It is September 48 BC. A 21-year-old woman crouches inside a linen sack slung over the shoulder of a single servant, moving through the corridors of the most heavily guarded palace in the ancient world. She has no army behind her, no guards, no weapons. She has been exiled from her own kingdom, hunted by her own brother's assassins, and driven into the desert with nothing. Every entrance to this palace is watched by soldiers who have orders to kill her on sight, and she is walking straight into the private chambers of the most dangerous man alive. Hollywood told you this was a love story. A beautiful queen rolled out of a carpet and into the arms of a Roman general. Soft lighting, romantic music, two powerful people falling helplessly for each other. That is not what happened. Not even close. What we found buried in Plutarch, Cassius Dio, Josephus, and the fragments that survived 2,000 years of Roman propaganda is something far darker than any screenplay. What happened was a calculation. A woman who had spent her entire life studying power, measuring weakness, and learning exactly how to position herself so that the most powerful man in the room would do whatever she needed him to do. Before that night was over, she would own Julius Caesar. Her name was Cleopatra VII Philopator. She was not Egyptian. She was not beautiful in the way the movies insist. And within 15 years of that night, every single sibling she had would be dead, drowned, poisoned, murdered in a sacred temple on her direct orders. She was a Ptolemy, the last breathing product of a 300-year dynasty built on incest, fratricide, and absolute domination. A family where brothers married sisters, mothers poisoned sons, and children ordered the execution of their own parents with less hesitation than it takes you to order coffee. Cleopatra did not survive that family by being soft. She survived by becoming the most ruthless member it ever produced. Hollywood gave you Elizabeth Taylor in eyeliner. History gave you something closer to a monster wearing a crown. This is not a love story. It never was. This is the story of how one woman eliminated every sibling who stood between her and the throne, seduced the two most powerful men Rome ever created, and nearly shattered the Roman Republic itself. Before we unspool that story from beginning to end, drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from right now, your city and your country. And if you have not subscribed yet, take 1 second to do it. Help us keep uncovering the stories that history tried to bury. To understand what Cleopatra was, you have to understand what made her, and what made her starts with a chest delivered to a woman on her birthday. Sometime in the 2nd century BC, a Ptolemaic king named Ptolemy VIII had a problem. He had married his niece. He had also married her mother. He held both women simultaneously, fathering children by each. When one of those women, his own former wife, began opposing him politically, he decided to send her a message. He seized her son, his own stepchild. He murdered the boy. Then he dismembered the body, placed the pieces inside a chest, and had it delivered to her as a birthday gift. That was not the act of a madman on the fringes of the dynasty. That was a king sitting on the throne of the wealthiest kingdom in the Mediterranean, ruling over millions. That was the family Cleopatra was born into, and she would outperform every single one of them. The Ptolemaic dynasty began in blood and never stopped bleeding. In 323 BC, Alexander the Great died in Babylon at the age of 32. He had conquered the largest empire the world had ever seen, and he left behind no clear successor. What followed was 40 years of the most savage power struggle in ancient history. Alexander's generals turned on each other like wolves, carving up his empire piece by piece. One of those generals was named Ptolemy, son of Lagus. He was clever enough to avoid the deadliest fights and strategic enough to seize the richest prize, Egypt. He installed himself first in Memphis, then in the gleaming new city of Alexandria, and founded a dynasty that would rule Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. The Ptolemies were not Egyptian. They were Macedonian Greeks. They spoke Greek. They administered in Greek. For 300 years, they sat on the throne of the Nile as foreigners, ruling a civilization thousands of years older than their own bloodline, and they held that throne through one principle above all others: keep the blood pure. Keep the power inside the family. That meant brothers married sisters, fathers married daughters, uncles married nieces, generation after generation. The Ptolemies intermarried with a consistency that bordered on religious devotion to inbreeding. It was not occasional, it was standard operating procedure. Ptolemy II married his full sister. Ptolemy IV married his sister and then almost certainly had her murdered when she became politically inconvenient. And Ptolemy VIII, the one with the birthday gift, was not an aberration. He was the family culture distilled to its purest form. Every generation of Ptolemies produced brilliant administrators and capable military commanders. Every generation also produced paranoid tyrants, fratricidal maniacs, and rulers who viewed family members not as people to be loved, but as threats to be neutralized. The pattern repeated itself with mechanical precision. A king would take the throne. His siblings would become rivals. One or more of those siblings would die, usually violently, usually at the hands of the survivor. The winner would then marry whoever was left standing, produce heirs, and the cycle would begin again. By the time Cleopatra was born, around 69 BC, the Ptolemaic dynasty had been devouring itself for over 250 years. The kingdom was still fabulously wealthy. Egypt's grain production alone made it the most economically vital territory in the Mediterranean. Whoever controlled Egypt controlled the food supply of the ancient world. But politically, the dynasty was rotting from the inside. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, was known by his own people by a nickname that tells you everything you need to know about how much they respected him. They called him Aulitz, the flute player, a weak king who spent more time performing music at banquets than governing his kingdom. He held his throne not through strength or competence, but through Roman patronage. He literally bribed Roman senators with staggering sums of borrowed money to recognize his claim. When his own citizens revolted against his subservience to Rome, he did not fight. He fled. He sailed to Italy and begged for a Roman army to put him back on his throne. They did. Roman legions marched into Egypt, crushed the revolt, slaughtered the opposition, and restored a king his own people despised. Cleopatra was approximately 11 years old when she watched her father crawl back into Alexandria on the backs of foreign soldiers. She stood inside that palace and absorbed every detail of what was happening. The Roman officers, the Egyptian bodies, the price her father had paid, and the weakness that had forced him to pay it. Into this dynasty of killers, into this palace of whispered plots and sudden disappearances, a girl was growing up who would outperform every single one of them. Chapter 3. The education of a predator. Cleopatra was not raised to be a queen the way fairy tales imagine queens are made. She was raised inside a court where assassination was the primary method of career advancement, and trust was a vulnerability that could get you killed. While her father was in Rome groveling before senators, her older sister Berenice IV saw an opportunity and seized the throne for herself. For roughly 2 years, Berenice ruled Egypt. She made alliances. She consolidated power. She believed she had won. Then Ptolemy XII returned with his Roman army. One of his first acts upon reclaiming the throne was to execute Berenice, his own daughter, beheaded on his orders. No trial, no exile, no mercy. Cleopatra was approximately 14 years old when that happened. She watched her own sister dragged away and killed by their father, and she learned the most important lesson the Ptolemaic court had to teach. In this family, you are either the one giving the orders or you are the one being carried out. The education she received beyond palace politics was extraordinary by any standard of the ancient world. She reportedly spoke 9 languages: Greek, Egyptian, Ethiopian, the language of the troglodytes, Hebrew, Arabic, Syriac, Median, and Parthian. She studied philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. She understood economics, taxation, and the mechanics of administration that kept Egypt's grain flowing to markets across the Mediterranean. But one detail matters more than all the others combined. Cleopatra was the first Ptolemaic ruler in 300 years to actually learn the Egyptian language. For 3 centuries, every Ptolemaic king and queen had governed through Greek translators, maintaining a deliberate cultural wall between themselves and the millions of Egyptians they ruled. They sat on Egyptian thrones, wore Egyptian crowns, and could not speak a single word to the people who grew their food, built their monuments, and filled their treasuries. Cleopatra tore that wall down. She spoke directly to Egyptian priests in their own tongue. She addressed crowds without interpreters, and she went further. She presented herself not merely as a Greek queen sitting on an Egyptian throne, but as a living incarnation of the goddess Isis, the most powerful female deity in the Egyptian pantheon. That was not religious conviction, that was branding. By merging herself with Isis, she transformed herself from a foreign occupier into a divine ruler in the eyes of millions. Ancient sources consistently describe her as possessing a voice of extraordinary beauty and persuasion. Plutarch, writing roughly a century after her death, stated something that contradicts nearly every movie ever made about her. Her physical appearance alone was not particularly striking. She was not the stunning beauty Hollywood insists upon. What made men fall was not her face, it was her presence, the texture and music of her voice, her ability to make any man in the room feel as though he were the only person who mattered. Her capacity to shift her personality, her energy, her entire approach within seconds to match whoever was sitting across from her. That skill was not charm, it was predation refined into an art form. The ability to read a target, identify their weaknesses, and become exactly what they needed you to be. In the Ptolemaic court, that ability was the difference between ruling and being buried. From her father's humiliation, she extracted 3 lessons that would define the rest of her life. First, the only real power in the Mediterranean belonged to Rome. Second, Roman power could be purchased, borrowed, or seduced. Third, any Egyptian ruler who depended on their own legitimacy alone was already dead. She filed those lessons away like weapons in an armory. She would need every one of them. In 51 BC, Ptolemy XII died. He left the throne jointly to 18-year-old Cleopatra and her 10-year-old brother, Ptolemy XIII. They were expected to rule together. They were also expected to marry each other, following the Ptolemaic tradition of sibling union. Cleopatra had absolutely no intention of sharing power with a child, but the boy had handlers, a group of ambitious eunuchs and court officials led by a man named Pothinus recognized that controlling a pliable 10-year-old was far easier than managing a fiercely intelligent young woman who clearly intended to rule alone. They built alliances with the Egyptian military, they isolated Cleopatra politically, and by 48 BC, they had driven her out of Alexandria entirely, exiled, stripped of her throne, hunted by soldiers loyal to a brother she had been forced to marry. Most people in her position would have accepted defeat, found refuge in a foreign court, lived out a quiet life in obscurity. Cleopatra gathered an army on Egypt's eastern border and prepared to fight her way back in. She was 21 years old. She was out of money, out of allies, and out of time. And then the most powerful man in the world sailed into Alexandria harbor and everything changed. Before we step into that palace and watch Cleopatra do what she was built to do, take 1 second. If you have not subscribed yet, do it now. Tap the like button so the algorithm pushes this story to more people who need to hear it. And drop a comment telling me where you are watching from, your city and your country. What happens next is the moment Hollywood turned into a love story. The real version is far worse. Chapter 4. Caesar and the first kills. In the summer of 48 BC, the Roman Republic was tearing itself apart. Julius Caesar and Pompey Magnus, once allies, had plunged Rome into civil war. Caesar shattered Pompey's army at the Battle of Pharsalus in August. Pompey fled east across the Mediterranean, searching for a safe harbor. He chose Egypt. It was the last decision he ever made. Ptolemy XIII's advisors saw a calculation, not a refugee. If they sheltered Pompey, they risked making an enemy of Caesar, who was pursuing him with a fleet. If they handed Pompey over alive, they gained nothing. But if they killed him and presented the corpse to Caesar as a gift, they could secure Roman favor for their boy king. On September 28, 48 BC, as Pompey stepped off a small boat onto the Egyptian shore, soldiers under Ptolemy's command stabbed him to death in the shallow water. They cut off his head and preserved it in a jar. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria days later, they presented the head on a platter. Caesar did not react with gratitude. According to ancient accounts, he wept. Whether those tears were genuine grief or calculated theater is debatable. What is not debatable is that Caesar was furious. Egyptian servants had dared to murder a Roman consul without Roman authority. He installed himself in the royal palace and summoned both Ptolemy XIII and Cleopatra to appear before him. He would settle the Egyptian succession personally. This was the moment. The problem was getting inside. Ptolemy's forces controlled Alexandria. If Cleopatra walked through the city openly, she would be arrested or killed before she reached the palace gates. So she arranged to be smuggled in. Plutarch describes her being wrapped in a linen sack or bedroll carried on the back of a single Sicilian merchant named Apollodorus and delivered directly to Caesar's private quarters. Picture the scene. Caesar is 52 years old. He is arguably the most powerful man in the Western world. He has just fought and won the decisive battle of a civil war. He sits in a foreign palace, surrounded by enemies, deciding the fate of a kingdom, and a 21-year-old woman materializes in front of him, utterly alone, without guards, without weapons, having smuggled herself past an army that wanted her dead just to reach this room. The audacity alone would have seized his attention, but Cleopatra did not rely on audacity alone. She spoke to him in fluent Latin, with a grasp of Roman politics and culture no other foreign ruler could match. She did not present herself as a desperate exile begging for rescue. She presented herself as an intelligent, capable partner offering an alliance that would benefit Rome as much as it benefited Egypt. Within hours, Caesar had made his decision. Cleopatra would be restored to the throne. When Ptolemy XIII learned his sister was not only inside the palace, but had already secured Caesar's support, he reportedly tore the royal diadem from his head and hurled it to the ground in a public tantrum. His advisors moved immediately from political maneuvering to open warfare. What followed was months of savage urban combat, the Alexandrian War. Ptolemy's forces, backed by a sizable Egyptian army, and the hostile population of Alexandria besieged Caesar and Cleopatra inside the royal quarter. Caesar had brought roughly 4,000 legionaries. He was trapped in a foreign city, fighting street by street, burning parts of the harbor to prevent the Egyptian fleet from being used against him. It was during this chaos that a fire spread and damaged structures near the waterfront. Ancient sources record that part of the great library of Alexandria was destroyed in the blaze. The siege lasted through the winter. Caesar received reinforcements. He maneuvered with the same tactical brilliance that had conquered Gaul. In early 47 BC, the decisive battle came along the banks of the Nile. Ptolemy XIII's forces were crushed. The 14-year-old king attempted to flee by boat across the river. The vessel capsized under the weight of panicking soldiers. Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile. Cleopatra's first sibling was dead. There's no surviving record from any ancient source that suggests she mourned for a single moment. She needed a new co-ruler. Ptolemaic tradition demanded a male counterpart on the throne. She chose her youngest brother, Ptolemy XIV. He was approximately 12 years old. Controllable, irrelevant to her. A rubber stamp wearing a crown, she married him as was custom. A 22-year-old woman marrying her prepubescent brother so that she could rule Egypt alone with full legal cover. Caesar remained in Egypt for months after the war ended. The relationship between him and Cleopatra produced a son. She named him Ptolemy XV, Philometor Caesar. History knows him as Caesarion, Little Caesar. The name was a weapon. By attaching Caesar's name to her child, Cleopatra was staking a claim that would echo through Rome for decades. This boy was not merely a Ptolemy, he was the biological heir of the most powerful man alive. In 46 BC, Cleopatra traveled to Rome itself. She installed herself in one of Caesar's properties across the Tiber, brought Caesarion, brought her brother husband, brought an entourage designed to display Egyptian wealth in a city that still called itself a republic. Caesar placed a golden statue of her inside the temple of Venus Genetrix, the shrine dedicated to the divine ancestor of his own family. He placed a foreign queen inside the temple of his own bloodline. The symbolism was not subtle. For nearly 2 years, Cleopatra operated at the center of Roman power. She watched Caesar accumulate titles. Dictator for life, his face on coins, a month renamed in his honor. She watched the Senate bend itself into increasingly absurd shapes to accommodate one man who looked more like a king with every passing day. Then on March 15th, 44 BC, 23 senators drove daggers into Caesar's body on the floor of the Senate House. He collapsed at the base of Pompey's statue and bled to death from 23 stab wounds. Cleopatra was still in Rome when it happened. Within days, she was gone. She packed her household, seized Caesarion, and sailed for Egypt with the speed of someone who understood exactly what Caesar's death meant. The protector was gone. Rome was about to descend into another civil war. Any foreign ruler associated with the fallen dictator was a target. She arrived back in Alexandria and assessed her position with cold precision. Ptolemy XIV, her brother husband, was still technically co-ruler. He was now approximately 15 years old enough to start developing ambitions, old enough for court factions to rally around as an alternative. Shortly after Cleopatra's return to Egypt, Ptolemy XIV died. The ancient historian Josephus states plainly that Cleopatra poisoned him. Her second sibling was dead. She immediately installed 3-year-old Caesarion as her new co-ruler, a toddler on the throne of Egypt, a toddler she controlled absolutely, and a toddler whose very name tied Egypt's future to the most powerful political legacy in the Western world. 2 siblings dead, but there was one left, her sister Arsinoe, hiding in one of the most sacred temples in the ancient world, protected by the gods themselves. Cleopatra did not care about the gods. Chapter 5, Antony and the Last Sister. Arsinoe IV had been a problem for years. During the Alexandrian War, she had escaped from the royal palace and joined the Egyptian forces fighting against Caesar and Cleopatra. The opposing faction had proclaimed her queen. She had commanded troops. She had organized resistance. She had very nearly succeeded in becoming the ruler of Egypt, while Cleopatra was pinned down inside the palace with Caesar. After Caesar's victory, Arsinoe was captured and shipped to Rome. She was paraded through the streets in Caesar's triumph, dragged in chains behind his chariot, displayed to the Roman crowds as a conquered enemy. The humiliation was supposed to be total, but something unexpected happened. The Roman crowds, who usually cheered the spectacle of defeated kings and queens in chains, looked at this young princess and felt sympathy. The applause turned to murmurs of discomfort. It was a rare moment where Roman cruelty collided with Roman sentiment, and sentiment won. Arsinoe was eventually released and took refuge in the temple of Artemis at Ephesus. in modern-day Turkey. The Temple of Artemis was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It was also one of the most sacred sanctuaries in the entire Mediterranean. The convention of the ancient world held that anyone who sought shelter in such a temple was inviolable. You did not enter a sanctuary and drag someone out to kill them. That was an act against the gods. Even Rome respected temple asylum. Cleopatra did not care about conventions. She did not care about temples. She cared about mathematics. And the math was simple. Arsinoe was alive. Arsinoe had once been proclaimed queen. Arsinoe could become a rallying point for any Egyptian faction that opposed Cleopatra's rule. As long as her sister breathed, Cleopatra's grip on the throne had a crack in it. She needed a Roman patron powerful enough to carry out the killing and brutal enough not to hesitate. Caesar was dead. She needed someone new. By 41 BC, the Roman world had been carved into 3 pieces. Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, controlled the West. Lepidus held Africa, and Marcus Antonius, Mark Antony, commanded the entire eastern half of the Roman world. He was the dominant military power from Greece to Syria. Antony was nothing like Caesar. Where Caesar had been cerebral, calculating, and ruthlessly disciplined, Antony was physical, impulsive, and driven by appetite. He was a superb battlefield commander, but an inconsistent politician. He drank heavily. He loved a spectacle and excess. He craved admiration the way some men crave air. Cleopatra understood everyone's weaknesses. She had spent her entire life cataloging them. Antony summoned her to Tarsus in southern Turkey to answer questions about her loyalty during the recent Roman civil wars. It was a power play. He was the master of the Eastern Mediterranean. She was a client queen being called to account. Cleopatra turned his summons into her entrance. She sailed up the river Kidnus on a barge with a gilded stern and purple sails. Silver oars struck the water in time to the music of flutes and lyres. She reclined beneath a canopy of gold cloth, dressed as Aphrodite, the goddess of love, attended by boys costumed as cupids, who fanned her with perfumed feathers. Incense burned along the riverbanks so thick the smoke drifted across the water. The entire city of Tarsus emptied to watch. Antony sat in the public square, waiting for the queen to present herself to him. Instead, every person in the city walked to the river to see the floating spectacle. He was left sitting alone. She did not go to Antony. She invited him to her. He came aboard for dinner. By the end of that evening, the power dynamic between the Roman general and the Egyptian queen had reversed completely. Within weeks, Antony followed Cleopatra to Alexandria. He spent the winter there, feasting, drinking, gambling, dressing in Greek clothing, attending Egyptian religious ceremonies. He behaved, in the eyes of conservative Rome, like a man who had been swallowed whole. And during that winter, between the feasts and the wine and the laughter, Cleopatra leaned across and made her request. She wanted Arsinoe dead, not exiled, not imprisoned, not watched, dead. Think about what that means. Her sister was sheltering inside one of the 7 wonders of the world, a temple so sacred that even conquering armies had left it untouched for centuries. The convention of the ancient Mediterranean, honored by Greeks, Persians, and Romans alike, held that anyone who sought refuge in such a place was under the protection of the gods. You did not cross that line. It was the one boundary that civilized people agreed was absolute. Cleopatra asked Antony to cross it, and he did. Roman soldiers marched into Ephesus. They climbed the steps of the Temple of Artemis. They walked past the columns, past the offerings, past the priests. They found Arsinoe. Somewhere inside that sacred precinct, a young woman who had survived a civil war, survived a Roman triumph in chains, survived years of exile, and had committed no crime other than sharing Cleopatra's blood. They killed her there, inside the temple, on sacred ground. The ancient world recoiled. The violation was so extreme that the priests of Ephesus formally protested. Even in a world soaked in political murder, this crossed a line that people believed the gods themselves would punish. Cleopatra did not care. Arsinoe was dead. The crack in her throne was sealed. Every brother, every sister, every potential rival who shared her blood was now in the ground. She had drowned one, poisoned another, and ordered the last one murdered in a sanctuary of the gods. She had done it without lifting a weapon herself. She had simply found men powerful enough to do it for her and given them a reason. She was 30 years old. She had outlasted every member of her family, and she was building something far more ambitious than personal survival. Cleopatra and Antony had 3 children together, twins named Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, followed by a son named Ptolemy Philadelphus. Antony also married Octavian's sister, Octavia, as part of a political agreement to maintain peace between Rome's power brokers. He now had a Roman wife in Rome and an Egyptian queen in Alexandria. Cleopatra did not object. She understood Roman politics well enough to recognize the marriage as a tool, not a threat. As long as Antony kept returning to Alexandria, kept funding her ambitions, and kept providing Roman military muscle, the existence of a Roman wife was irrelevant. In 34 BC, Antony staged an event in Alexandria that crossed every line Rome had ever drawn: the donations of Alexandria. In a grand public ceremony, he distributed eastern territories to Cleopatra and her children, as though they were his personal property to give away. Cleopatra was proclaimed Queen of Kings. Caesarion, her son by Julius Caesar, was declared King of Kings and the legitimate heir of Caesar himself. Their children received Armenia, Media, Cyrenaica, Libya, Syria, and Cilicia. These were not symbolic titles. These were actual Roman territorial claims being handed to a foreign queen and her children. For Octavian, sitting in Rome, this was the opening he had been waiting for. He did not frame the coming war as Roman against Roman. He framed it as Rome against Egypt, Rome against Cleopatra, a foreign queen who had seduced and corrupted a once great Roman general and was now attempting to devour the Republic from the inside. The propaganda was devastating. Roman poets and politicians painted Cleopatra as a witch, a seductress, a monster from the east. Whether any of it was fair is beside the point. It was effective. Antony's Roman allies melted away. Senators defected. Military commanders switched sides. Octavian was coming, and he had already decided exactly how Cleopatra's story would end. She just did not know it yet. Chapter 6. Actium, Death, and the Real Monster. On September 2nd, 31 BC, the fleets of Antony and Cleopatra met Octavian's navy at the Battle of Actium off the western coast of Greece. It was supposed to be the decisive engagement that would determine who ruled the Mediterranean. Antony's fleet was larger, but crippled by desertions, disease, and collapsing morale. His ships were heavy and undermanned. His battle plan, if there ever was a coherent one, fell apart almost immediately. Cleopatra commanded a squadron of 60 Egyptian warships positioned at the rear of the formation. When the battle turned against them, she broke through the enemy line and sailed south toward Egypt. Antony, seeing her ships pulling away, abandoned his own fleet and followed her. His soldiers watched their commander sail away in the middle of a battle. The psychological destruction was total. The remaining fleet surrendered or was destroyed. Antony's land forces, abandoned without leadership, capitulated within days. Some historians call it cowardice. Others argue it was a prearranged escape plan, a calculated decision to preserve the Egyptian treasury and the core fleet for a future fight. The truth almost certainly lies in the calculation. Cleopatra was not a woman who panicked. She was a woman who assessed odds. The battle was lost. Staying meant losing the ships, the treasury, and herself. Leaving meant preserving at least the possibility of a survival. Antony did not recover. The man who had once commanded half the Roman world unraveled. He alternated between despairing isolation and frantic attempts at negotiation. He sent messages to Octavian offering concessions, retirement, anything. Octavian ignored every single one. He did not negotiate. He eliminated. In the summer of 30 BC, Octavian's forces landed in Egypt and advanced on Alexandria. Antony attempted a final military stand. His remaining troops deserted to the enemy. His cavalry rode over to Octavian's side without a single sword being drawn. His fleet surrendered in the harbor without a fight. Then a rumor reached Antony that Cleopatra was dead. Whether she deliberately sent that message to manipulate him into what happened next is one of history's unanswered questions. Antony drove his sword into his own stomach. He did not die immediately. Wounded and bleeding, he was carried to the mausoleum where Cleopatra had barricaded herself with her treasure. She had him hauled up through a window on ropes because she refused to open the doors. He died in her arms. Cleopatra did not immediately follow him into death. She tried to negotiate with Octavian. She offered money. She offered abdication. She reportedly attempted to charm him the way she had charmed Caesar at 21 and Antony at 28. Octavian was 33 years old. He was cold, methodical, and entirely immune to the kind of personal magnetism that had worked on every man before him. Octavian wanted one thing from Cleopatra. He wanted to parade her through the streets of Rome in his triumph. The conquered queen of Egypt, walking in chains behind his chariot, displayed to the Roman people as living proof of his victory. Cleopatra understood exactly what that meant. She had watched her own sister Arsinoe endured that same procession years earlier. She had then arranged for Arsinoe to be murdered rather than allow her to remain alive as a rival. She knew what happened to queens who were paraded through Rome. She would not submit to the same fate. On August 12th, 30 BC, Cleopatra, dressed in her full royal regalia, arranged herself on a golden couch and died. The ancient tradition says she was killed by the bite of an asp, an Egyptian cobra smuggled into her chamber in a basket of figs. Modern scholars debate this. A cobra bite is slow, painful, and unreliable. A queen with access to Egypt's finest physicians and chemists could certainly have obtained something faster and more controlled. However she did it, the staging was deliberate. When Octavian's soldiers broke into the chamber, they found Cleopatra dead on her couch, flanked by two handmaidens who had also died. One, named Iris, had already collapsed. The other, Charmian, was still alive, barely, using her last strength to adjust the crown on Cleopatra's head. A Roman soldier reportedly asked whether this was a fine sight. Charmian answered with her dying breath. It was entirely fitting, she said, for a woman descended from so many kings. Even in death, she was still the queen. But before the crown went still, there was one final calculation Octavian had to make, and it involved a 17-year-old boy. Octavian got his conquest, just not the version he wanted. He displayed her image in his triumph, a painting of the queen with a serpent on her arm. Then he dealt with the loose ends. Caesarion, Cleopatra's 17-year-old son by Julius Caesar, had been sent south in an attempt to escape. Octavian's agents tracked him down and killed him. The reasoning was simple. Caesarion was Caesar's biological son. As long as he lived, he represented an alternative claim to the political legacy Octavian had built his entire career upon. Two Caesars could not exist. Cleopatra's 3 children by Antony were spared. They were taken to Rome and raised by Octavia, Antony's Roman wife. The children of Egypt's last queen grew up as Romans, stripped of their mother's name and legacy, absorbed into the empire she had tried to resist. Egypt became a Roman province, not an ordinary one, but the personal property of the emperor. Octavian, soon to be Augustus, understood that Egypt's wealth was too dangerous to entrust to any potential rival. He made it illegal for any Roman senator to even visit Egypt without his explicit permission. The Ptolemaic dynasty, 300 years of blood and brilliance, ended with Cleopatra, the last queen of an ancient bloodline, the final product of centuries of calculated marriages, strategic murders, and absolute power. Hollywood gave the world a love story, a beautiful woman who died of a broken heart. That is a lie polished smoothed by 2,000 years of retelling. The truth is this: a woman was born into a family of killers. She survived by becoming the most effective killer among them. She eliminated 3 siblings. She seduced 2 of the most powerful men in human history, not out of passion, but out of a strategic necessity. She ruled the richest kingdom in the ancient world for 21 years. She produced heirs designed to merge Ptolemaic and Roman bloodlines into a new dynasty that would have controlled everything from the Nile to the Tiber. When the final defeat came, she chose death on her own terms rather than give an enemy the satisfaction of displaying her in chains. She was brilliant. She was multilingual. She was politically gifted. She was also someone who poisoned her own brother and ordered her sister murdered in a sacred temple. Everything else was in service of one thing: power. The crown stayed on her head until the very last moment. Even as she lay dying, Charmian adjusted it. Even in death, she refused to let it slip. Her tomb has never been found. 2,000 years of searching, and the last queen of Egypt has denied the world the one thing it most desperately wants: proof. A woman who spent her entire life controlling her own story has, in death, left that story unfinished. You have walked this entire path with us, from the blood-soaked palaces of the Ptolemies, through the courts of Caesar and Antony, into the final chamber where a queen chose poison over chains. If you are still here at this final line, thank you. Now take 1 second right now and hit subscribe. Tap the like button so the algorithm pushes this story to more people who deserve to hear it. Share this video with someone who still believes Cleopatra was a love story. Show them what she actually was.